Hello, everybody. I'm Bob Mover, and I am welcoming you to our podcast, On the Real Side. Music you're listening to is by Walter Davis Jr., a tune of his called On the Real Side, the great Walter Davis Jr. And today, our guest, I'm very happy to have the great Bennie Wallace with us. And Bennie is a very unique and original musician and amazing saxophone player, and also one of my good friends. And we were having such a good time talking that in the 20 minutes we were here early, just kind of making sure all the technical things were working. We got into 4 or 5 subjects that I had to tell Benny, no, not now. I want to talk about it in the podcast because once we start going, we have so many common memories and common things and things that are different. I think Benny and we've always had fascinating discussions together, just the two of us. We could talk forever. And I want to say, welcome, Benny.
Thank you, Bob. I'm so happy to be here, man.
Yeah, I am too, to have you. Um, so, I prepared a whole bunch of questions to ask you, and I've done my Bennie Wallace research because, often when I'm talking to my friends, I don't know their recording careers the way a critic might or this and that. I know them from experience with each other, and I know bandstand and off the bandstand and having fun and this kind of thing. So I actually try to do some research and find out things that I didn't know, about Benny. But some things I did know and always wanted to ask him. There's another thing is we don't usually get to talk about these things with people, but somebody's childhood. Benny originally came from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and as he used to say, I remember he always said he called it Tennessee, not Tennessee. Right, right. He said used to say
That's the correct pronunciation.
It is correct, yes. And we were talking about actually one thing we touched on before the show started was country music, and that kind of uh, growing up in an environment that was largely country music. How did that affect you, Benny? Growing up in.
Well, it's funny. When I was a little kid, maybe 5 years old, and we got a TV, there was a regional program on called the Martha White Hour, which was Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs live every week. And those, like I liked that. It didn't inspire me in any way, but I remember really liking it. And then when I grew up and met real bluegrass musicians and they played me tapes of that show, I realized those guys were really good. And
They were. I've heard them. They were wonderful. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and they were. I remember one of my bluegrass friends told me that Foggy Mountain Breakdown was recorded in a motel room during a thunderstorm.
Really?
Yeah, but then we had this TV and there would be some music on variety shows. And I remember sometimes I really liked it when Hoagie Carmichael would come on and sing and play the piano, or I think maybe there was another fellow, I can't remember his name right now, but anyway, it wasn't until I was about 11 years old and my mother bought me a couple of records and one of them was a Benny Goodman record, which I listened to a couple of times. And I kind of liked it. I'd just gotten a clarinet, and he was a great clarinet player. But the other one she gave me was this record called The President Meets the Count. And I had no idea who the president was, but I knew who the Count was because my parents loved big bands, And it was Lester Young's first record date, the one with Jimmy Rushing and Carl Smith,
Smith Jones Incorporated originally.
Right. And I just fell in love with that record, and I really didn't know much about the tenor saxophone, but I loved the feel of it, and I loved the way Jimmy Rushing sang. And, I just listened to that thing over and over. And
Yeah,
then,
evening and that stuff. Yeah.
oh man, that was,
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but I won't be wrong always.
Always. Yeah.
But then, like the next year, I was playing the clarinet, and then the next year we got a new band teacher in our school who was a jazz musician who had an agenda of starting a jazz band. And since I played the clarinet, he gave me this old Pan American saxophone and this record, which we've talked about before, of Sonny Rollins and Dizzy Gillespie playing this medium tempo F blues. And he said, try to do something like this. And I tell people I'm still trying,
Yeah, right.
but
Wheatley Hall is a medium up tempo, right? It was kind of
that whole side, I just fell in love with that. I listened to that side of the record. Yeah, I listened to that side of the record over and over and over. But we had a little tune in our band that was an F blues at that tempo, so I was supposed to play something like that. I can't hear you now.
Yeah, no. I just was talking to myself for a second.
Oh, okay. So, so getting back to country music, I just, at that point, I was a real snob. I didn't like rock and roll. I didn't like anything but jazz. And I didn't start listening to country music again until I moved to New York. And I started listening to it for the humor in it, because I would hear these funny tunes and I would be thinking about these housewives down there crying while they're like doing the dishes and stuff, and all those songs. And it was kind of like a little musical respite from all the jazz I was listening to, and so now I still like I still go back and find like those old country singers, like like Mose Allison and I used to talk about it. Like Merle Haggard was the perfect singer. He had a beautiful voice, beautiful phrasing and intonation, and he was like totally relaxed when he sang. Mose would talk about how, look at his face, like every muscle is relaxed, and so I still listen to that music from time to time,
Since you mentioned Mose, I know you're on that record, Ever Since the World Ended.
Right.
Which is a great record. I knew that record. It's lovely. I never got to know Mose Allison very well, or I met him on occasion. He seemed a rather acerbic type of personality. How did you find him what was like your experience like with Mose? Because I was always fascinated with Mose.
Well, and again, coming from the South, and when I was a teenager, by the time I got to college, we were all listening to Mose Allison's records. Those funny vocals that.
Sure. Yeah.
I would buy all those records when they would come out, because they were, they really kind of touched being a Southerner, particularly a leftist Southerner,
Yeah.
And then how did I meet Mose? Maybe it was through Tom Whaley. I'm not sure, but I met him. I met him a long time ago, and then we became friends. And I always suspected that Mose was like really into William Faulkner, and I was really into William Faulkner too. And I asked him about Faulkner, and he just changed the subject to Celine, and he started giving me these Celine books, and we used to talk about books, and he would like sing me lyrics to his tunes that I didn't know, and then at one point we played a couple of gigs together, and that was a lot of fun. But we were friends all through the years, until he died.
Huh. That's so nice. I was thinking, as you said, being leftist Southerners, I'd always wanted to, say that, thinking about, obviously your parents tended to be liberal, liberal-minded. I mean, that they got you a Count Basie record with Lester Young. That just about says it all right there.
Well, my folks were I think as apolitical as you could get. They just loved to jitterbug, and they loved to listen to all those big bands. Among them was Count Basie, and my folks were just like they were bright. They were very loving and really were great parents to me. But this music world was another challenge to them, you know.
What did they do? What was their?
My dad worked for the phone company, and my mother, when I was growing up, was you know, stayed at home and tried to keep me out of trouble. And then when I grew up, she went back to work for this company that she'd worked for before.
You were an only
But
child.
yeah, yeah, and which is another problem.
Yeah, right there.
Because you know, everybody thinks, oh, only children are spoiled, which is probably true, but you're also, you know, you've got this responsibility not to disappoint them too much because they don't have another one to lean
All
on.
back on.
Yeah, and I presented some real challenges in that department.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I was thinking also. So you didn't really. I mean, because you were actually growing up in the pre-Civil Rights Act South. I mean, you were a teenager in 1964
Yeah,
when that stuff really went down, the marches and all of that.
yeah.
So you must have experienced. You didn't go to school in an integrated world, and
Oh no, no, no. My little community was like, you know, they were like working class rednecks mostly, you know. But they did produce quite a few, I should have said, instead of leftists, I should say, you know, Southern liberals, you know, and some of which are whom are still around today, and I communicate with them from time. You'd be surprised how many of them are still down there. But you know, when my teacher came when I was in the 8th grade with all these records, you know, Count Basie records and Dizzy Gillespie records, stuff like that. Like, I mean, we were just getting to the age where we were becoming aware of race at all, you know, and so immediately, you know, we knew any discrimination against people like this is just utterly ridiculous. So you know, he really straightened us out before we needed straightening out. And you know, because whenever Basie's band would come to town, we would all flock down there to hear it. It was like the big event of the year, you know. And so, you know, and as the civil rights movement progressed, like, well, for example, like when I was still in high school, I used to go down to these after hours places and sit in with the jazz bands, you know, and remember a saxophone player named Fred Jackson. He was on Blue Note for a minute, and Hurricane Jackson, they called him. And I remember going down and playing with
I don't
him
remember the name, but I don't know.
one day. But you know, there was like a little scene down there, and I used to go, and then when I was at the end of my freshman year of college, they gave me the gig as the band leader there, and all of my training performing was playing in these all black after hours joints down there, and you know, like the authorities like really frowned on even white people coming in the audience, you know, and so it that's a whole other show.
Oh, that's an interesting aspect of things, though, that I wanted to get to. Just you're already a nonconformist by just playing this music or think about that, especially in the world in general, but is especially in an area, like you're talking about. Did you know a guy named Travis Jenkins at all?
I've heard that name, but I didn't know him.
Travis Jenkins was a bitch, man. He was a great player. He was also from, I think, Virginia or somewhere in the South. He was the
Uh-huh.
first guy I met who was a white Southerner playing tenor, and
Uh-huh.
he could hold. I met him in the '60s. He was hanging out with Kenny Dorham, Win Kelly, and these people. And Travis could play. I heard he went back to the South and actually did play with some rock band for a while and had some success. But I don't know. But I mean, he was quite an amazing player. But yeah, he was the first. Also, you mentioned the idea of the high school band teacher and the junior high school band teacher. I think is like they don't get enough credit. When you mention somebody like this cat, and I had a couple too that were like very just dedicated. And when they saw you had some interest that was beyond the average level of junior high school interest in something, when they saw you were serious about it, they would really spend time with you and help you out and do what your teacher did. I had a couple of cats. One was a guy named Howard Chapman. For 1 year, I went to school in Ohio for half of a school year, and Howard just he knew I was dedicated, and he gave me the key to the band room. I couldn't play in my apartment building where I was living, and we didn't have a piano there, and I wanted to sit every day and play at the piano, learn tunes and everything. And I was 15, and Howard said, "Here's the key to the band room. You can get here an hour, hour and a half early in the day. That's when they open the school. Go ahead into the room and just stay there until I come in. Give me the key, and at the end of the night, come and get the key. You can come and practice after school. I'll stay and wait for you." And he was like that. And then he'd take me to his house, and he loved Richie Camuca, who I later studied with. He was a trombone player himself, but he said, "This is a beautiful tenor saxophone sound." He said, and he would listen to that. And he had electric trains all in his house. They ran up and down the stairs. He was like crazy with his family. Anyway, he was a wonderful guy. But a guy like that, Howard, you just don't see, how much credit that how dedicated they were to it too.
Well, see, we had a band, like a 16-piece band, and so he would bring his Chet Hedgecoth was his name, and he would bring his jazz records, which were all scratched up, and just leave them around. He wouldn't loan them to us, but he would let us steal them, and we would steal them and trade them back and forth. Only except for that Sonny Rollins and Dizzy record, he gave me that one at this initiation, but and then he didn't give us the key to the band room, but we would, when he was over in the other building, we would skip class and go practice, and there was a lot of that going on,
Yeah, I had a later teacher like that was like that too. He just said, "Well, you're welcome to come here anytime you want and practice. Just I didn't see you. I don't know where you are. If they ask, I don't know anything, so it's okay."
Yeah.
And he was a guy named Joe Brindisi, and that was in Miami Beach in high school. We would, after school, he would stay with me. I would go. We played this piece, Opus in Pastels, which was a Stan Kenton feature for the saxophones. We just played the two alto parts, and we actually performed them at a ninth grade recital. We did that. And and he'd be sitting there practicing Coltrane solo from like Someone in Love. I remember he was doing that, and he was another one of those guys who really would take time with you. So another thing I was thinking about was you yourself now doing work with young people. You were telling me about the African kids and all of that. Let's talk about your present endeavors, your educational thing that you've been running. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, in 2006, I was playing these occasional gigs down in Princeton in a living room with a professor's living room with Mulgrew Miller and Bill Huntington, bass player. And I thought, well, if they've got a living room like this in Princeton, there must be a bunch of them in Greenwich. Long story short, a friend of mine found a private art gallery, really in walking distance of my house that I didn't even know was there. And he arranged for us to do a concert. And so I put together a quartet with Mulgrew, and the guy said, "You can have 75 people." We had 75 people. It was a lot of fun. And then the next day, this guy called me and he said, "If you want," he said, "I think you should start a nonprofit organization to do these concerts, and I'll contribute to it." And then a few minutes later, I get a call from this lady who was there, who's was a real philanthropist, wonderful lady named Joan Warburg. And Joan says, "Every year we have our charity benefit, and we've never had jazz. I want you to do it." And so those two phone calls started Backcountry Jazz. And before
it's called Backcountry Jazz.
Yeah, it's called Backcountry Jazz because this area of Greenwich is called the Backcountry.
We're talking about Connecticut. If you people don't know, we're talking about Greenwich.
Yeah. Well, Godwin Louis and I call it the cradle of jazz.
What was that?
We call Connecticut the cradle of jazz.
Cradle of jazz.
Yeah, but anyway, before the recession, we started doing these concerts, and they were free. Like people would just come and they would make a donation. And before we knew it, Bob, we had $150,000 in the bank. and then the recession hit, and we went to Bridgeport to do a concert, and we got recruited up there to work with basically underserved kids in Bridgeport. And the $150,000 went away just like that, you know. But we've been, in some capacity, we've been up there for, I guess, about 15 years. And it started out, we were doing like a month-long summer music program for just children to keep them off the street and doing, you know, simple music. And over the years, it evolved to a jazz program. And we have like really great jazz musicians come up and teach these kids. And, you know, like, I'm trying to think, Alvester Garnett and what Regina Carter and Harold Stafford, Joe Magnarelli, like Victor Lewis, all these musicians from time to time would come up and work with the kids. And it's always musicians of that level. And it's really just gotten better and better over the years. And, you know, I've got to where that when I go there, like I learn more than the kids do. And so, you know, we do that in July, and then we have a small after school program during the school year, one day a week. And it's quite, you know, it's quite a challenge each year to raise the money to do it. And of course, and now since COVID, we've started the Greenwich Jazz Festival. And like the month after COVID, I heard this doctor on the radio say, as long as you're outside more than 6 feet apart, you're safe. And we've got this huge lawn. And so we started doing, you know, musicians didn't have a gig, people had nothing to do. So we started doing these concerts on the lawn, free concerts.
Lawn is on your property or on the?
Yeah, on my property. Yeah.
Right.
And you know, we would just set up out in the grass with no PA system or anything and just play. And we started out with 40 people. By the end of that summer, we had like 130 people. And so now we're in the fourth year now, and we're getting like 200 or 300 people for each one of them. We're like, this summer we're doing, I think, 9 or 10 concerts. And so all this stuff really keeps me busy and keeps me busy raising the money to keep doing it, you know.
I see. Now that you told me this wonderful story about these Africans coming, and you had like 15 or 10 Africans playing Embraceable You. Can you tell that story? Like,
yeah, well, you know, one day, like I had this little, what's it called? An Instagram account that where it was me and my kids mostly. And I would keep an eye on them by seeing what they were posting on Instagram, you know. And so this thing came on one day of these two literally children standing out in a field playing alto saxophones. And they're like playing some kind, I didn't recognize the tune, but they're playing some kind of bebop-like thing and just getting it, you know, just going after it, just two saxophone players and nothing else. And so Godwin Louis been going to Africa for years, you know, and teaching. And so I called Godwin. I said, "Are these some of yours?" And because it looked like African names, although there was no mention of where on the planet they were. He said, "No, I never heard of them." And so a few months later, I get this call from Godwin from Nigeria, and he says, "I found them, and there are 50 of them." And so as a result of that, we invited them to bring, you know, to come over and join because the summer thing that we do in July is free. So I said, you know, if you guys can get your way over here and a place to stay, you're welcome to come and join. And so last year and this summer they came, and these guys, they were performers, you know, like they play that African funk music or African beat, whatever they call it. It'll be like a one chord, and they jam over it, you know.
how old was the average age of these kids?
Well, now these two kids that I was talking about were 11 years old.
Right. I remember.
And I remember I was working with him and this girl, and maybe he was 12 by this time, and the girl was tall, so I figured she must be like 16 or something. And I asked her, I said, I was asking them who their favorite saxophone player was, and he said Charlie Parker, and she said Candy Dulfer.
Mm-hmm.
And And I said, well, those are good choices. And he goes, I don't know how well you know Candy, but she can play. And I said, well, how old are you, the little girl? She says, 11. And these kids could do this thing, but God help them when they get to a bridge. They just, they just had no sense of form at all. And so this year, when they came back, we developed a program specifically for them to really address that problem. And I had two teachers really working on it and doing a great job. And by the end of the fourth week or third week, they could all play a credible solo on Embraceable You.
That's a pretty amazing thing to be able to do at any age.
And I told them, I said, a tenor saxophone player should know Coleman Hawkins recording solo on Body and Soul. But Godwin and I had talked about it, and the counterpart that for an alto player is Parker's Mood. And the guy that had been teaching them, who's very young, he says, well, I've taught them the first course. And these 6 kids played the first course of it in unison.
Yeah, well, that's a reasonable thing to play too. I mean, as
Yeah.
it teaches you the phrasing and the feeling of that, and it's not so technically. He only has one little double time phrase in there. In those, that's the only double time phrase in the whole first chorus of Parker's Mood.
Yeah.
Main part. So, yeah, and that I remember learning that around that. Being a little bit older than that, and saying, "Oh, it's not that hard." You could play one chorus along with the record, and be Charlie Parker for that moment. Just feeling that.
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah.
great thing. Now, the other thing, talk about young people. We were talking a little before we started about our good friend Dennis Irwin, who was just a wonderful, wonderful musician and just an amazing human being. And we, I think I don't know, remember if I met Dennis through you, or I don't know how I met Dennis really, but he was just there, and he had just come from North Texas State,
Mm-hmm.
and I met him. We played a couple of sessions together. I think you were at these sessions. That might be, and then I had a gig at the Tin Palace, and I put Dennis in my band at that point. That was how we met. But you said you had known Dennis when Dennis was a teenager as well.
Yeah, in high school, and he was a clarinet player, and he was
Right.
taking clarinet lessons from my clarinet teacher, and so I remember he would, like, when he would finish his clarinet lesson, we would be having a jam session in a classroom somewhere, and he would come and listen, but he hadn't started playing the bass then. And then his father moved to Texas, and he went to North Texas and became Dennis Irwin.
Right. Now, he told me he didn't even play bass until he went to Texas. Actually,
Right. He played clarinet. Yeah.
And they needed somebody for the school, for the big band.
Yeah.
And so he started to do that. And he did continue to play the clarinet though later on, because he got it very into chorinho, into the Brazilian chorinho style, which was like Pichinguinha, and well, Tico Tico is your most popular chorinho. Everybody knows that one. But Dennis was a real musicologist. And
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I remember I played, this is 20 years ago, it seems more recent, but I played some gigs with him in Europe. And one night after the gig, we were drinking that Belgian beer, and he got out his clarinet and started playing it,
Right, and he still had chops, right? I mean,
he still had chops. And see, that's this thing about Dennis. Like, he was such a traditional bass player in the best sense of the word, in that he wasn't schooled. When I didn't know it until after Dennis was gone, but at North Texas, what's that bass player's name who played with Bill Evans at the end of his career?
Mark Johnson.
Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson was in the #1 band, and he was a bass player, and Dennis was the bass player in the #2 band. And yeah, and but his Mark is like I worked with him a little bit a few years ago. He's a very schooled modern bass player. And Dennis was like, he was right out of the old tradition before people, now it's become like a thing with young players to play just like PC or play just like Wilbur Ware. But in those, like, Dennis didn't do that. Like he like was another one of those guys. You know,
Oscar Pettiford, man, he loved Oscar Pettiford.
yeah. And Dennis had that big sound and big time, and he was so dedicated to it. And Dennis, we won't get too far into it, but Dennis really lived the jazz life. And
Yeah,
this really brilliant musicologist in Dennis was just like would jolt you that this same guy was so astute about so many different kinds of music. I mean, we would listen to all kinds of stuff together, and he would turn me on to stuff that I didn't
yeah.
know.
Well, he and Joe Cohn would they would just. I said what he said. What he used to do. They used to escape for a weekend or several days together, and he said basically they like to get high and sight read.
There you go. That's it. And that
Joe
Dennis.
would play piano, because
Uh-huh.
he liked to play classical piano,
Hmm.
and Dennis would get his clarinet out, and they would do this together, and then he'd say, that was their wonderful form of recreation, that they would have together. And and Dennis also he did great. Remember, he did his impression of Lord Buckley. He did all
Oh
that
yeah,
stuff.
Lord Buckley and Jerry Clower. He could do all those guys.
Yeah, he was a
And
great.
Dave, he could do Dave Gardner. Uh,
Oh man,
Dennis was a trip, man. I loved him dearly.
yeah. Well, in uh, yeah, in fact, we found out about his illness. Dennis died of cancer. He was supposed to come to my. We did a record date together, and he was supposed to come to the mixing session with me
Hmm.
because I don't like to be my only ears there besides the engineer, and I always have one buddy come with me to the
Sure.
mix. So Dennis was my man for that, and he was all set to do it. And he said that he really couldn't make it because his back was hurting, and he couldn't.
Yeah.
He couldn't do that. So that's how it began. That actually I sent him to the doctor, and the doctor was my ex-wife, and she sent him to another doctor, and that's how the diagnosis happened and everything. But it was a drag because he was just one of a kind. But to go on, let's get back to Bennie Wallace. You went to the University of Tennessee for a little while as a clarinet major. Now your trajectory now, I want to trace. How did you get to? We met in New York, I believe, in 1972 or 73 is when you and I met, and we started practicing together and jamming together uh, at that age. So, but you came to New York a little bit before in 71 or something. What happened? You go to Tennessee, and what brings you to New York, and what happens to me the story?
Well, when I think back about it, my high school education musically was much better than my college education. I got recruited into this school and with a scholarship, and it was a terrible school, the University of Tennessee, and there was a jazz band, but it wasn't really directly associated with the school. And I didn't study any jazz at all. It was just classical clarinet for 4 years. And during that time, the Vietnam thing got really hot, and I just consider myself to have been near the top of my class in draft dodging. And
Yeah.
and 4 years at the University of Tennessee got me out of Vietnam. And so in that sense, it was a success because I almost went to North Texas. And if I had, what would have happened? Or I could have gone to Northwestern, and what would have happened? Been much better education. But so anyway, I did that, and then I just kind of bummed around for a year or two playing in various bands. And I would hang out at the University of Indiana with some of my friends that went there, and we would just jam. And then I went to Boston for a year and studied privately with Joe Viola, which was a really good experience because I had studied with Joe right after I got out of high school for a few weeks. They had this little contest, and if you won, you could go to Berkeley free for 6 weeks, and if you came in second, you could go to Berkeley for 12 weeks. But
Oh, did you go to the Berkeley? I see. You went to the
yeah,
summer thing.
summer of '64. And then after college, I went back for a year and I studied with Joe, and I met some really good musicians and played. And then I met Gary Burton, and Gary had heard me play and kind of knew a little of my history. And he says, when you went to Boston, did you notice that your playing got better after you went to Boston? He said, it went up a level, right? And I said, yeah, because he had done the same thing. He says, well, when you go to New York, it's going to happen again. And so he gave me, he says, who do you know anybody in New York? And I said, well, I've met Randy Brecker and I knew Mike Brecker and I've met Dave Liebman and I remember a couple of other pieces. Okay, you know enough people. He says, there's only two things you need to know. Gary probably get mad at me when I tell this. He says, when you go to New York, don't do any business dealings with Paul Bley and stay away from Larry Coryell's wife.
Julie.
And both, that he said, that's all you need to know. And so I came to New York with $275 and no place to stay. And I wound up getting a spot in this loft, but they said I couldn't practice there. So I started going up to Charlie Colin's music studios and practicing during the day. And I'd been up there for a week. And this guy knocked on the door and he says, do you want a gig? And I said, yes. And he says, are you in the union? And I said, no. And he says, I'll get you in union. Come across the street. We're rehearsing right now. And the gig starts next Monday. And it was Monty Alexander. And Eugene Wright was the bass player. Frank Strozier was the alto player. Cecil Bridgewater was the trumpet player. And all of a sudden, I'm playing with these guys 6 nights a week for half the summer. And it was the only reason that I didn't bomb out, that I had enough money to stay.
Well, that's a hell of a place to start.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, like when Frank would send a sub, it would be George Coleman. And when Eugene Wright would send a sub, it would be Cranshaw, Bob Cranshaw.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So anyway, Monty saved my butt. And so I'm still here.
Wow. What was Strozier like?
Strozier was fantastic. We had so much fun. He had an incredible sense of humor. I've never laughed so much in my life as we laughed on that gig. And I remember the first night, the first tune, it was a blues and it was in B flat. And as soon as and Monty pointed at me, and as soon as the head was over, he went into a different key with no warning, And so I think he went to G or something like that. So like all during my solo, like I'm feeling my way through it. And when I finished my solo, Strozier looks at me and gave me a thumbs up, and we were friends from then on. But I remember one night, Monty was and I'm sure still is a great showman and really knew how to pace a set and knew how to play for an audience. And one night the place is just people are just going nuts. The dance floor is full and the tune's getting really intense. And Monty says, everybody freak out. And Senator went into this level of walking I'd never heard before. And he was like right next to my shoulder. And I started playing all my crazy shit. Strozier gets up and starts taking his pants off. Oh, I loved him, man. He was really, and just, such a beautiful player. And to hear him every night, like because being among that generation like you, that's coming out of Bird, he didn't sound anything like Bird, but you knew that was the source,
Well, that was why he was such an inspiration to me.
Oh, yeah, me too. Just boy, I can, right now when we're talking about him, like I hear that sound and I hear that phrasing, just
Me too. I'll tell you, I just hear You know, and I mean that you heard him sitting next to him. You know, I played opposite him once when he was with George Coleman's octet, and I was with Chet Baker. We had a radio show we did from the Village Gate one night, and you know, I got to hear him that way, and I never approached him or talked to him or you know or anything. I mean, I just
Uh-huh.
never. He was somebody I always meant to contact. I heard he had a thing with reeds. He got very obsessed with reeds and mouthpieces, especially reeds. Because actually, one summer, I had a gig in Port Chester, New York, in a place called the White Elephant with a trumpet player who also played saxophone, but he was playing trumpet on this, named Glenn Zatola.
I've heard of him, yeah.
You know, and Glenn, I did this gig pretty steadily in 1974, 73, 74. You know, when it was a Wednesday night regular gig, and usually when I was with Chet, we had the other nights, we had the weekends or this and that. But I found my way to do that gig most of the time. So when I left for Brazil, they said, "Oh, by the way, we've got Frank Strozier to replace you while you're gone." And I'm saying, "Well, goodbye to that gig." That's the end of this one.
Oh, I don't know about that, but yeah, but he was, man. And you know, it was years after I played with him that I found his records, and you know, and just that was a whole other
Yeah,
discovery.
that long night record, that one side of that with How Little We Know and The Gal That Got Away and that stuff, that's still one of my classic
Um,
records. You know, but anyway, the story with Strozier that was weird was when I got back, they said, "So you back to the gig? You want to come? You got your gig back?" I said, "You sure?" You know what? They said, "Oh, Strozier was wonderful." They said, "But he drove us crazy. He kept changing reeds like 6 times a set. He was, you know, and then of course the story of Frank Strozier is, you know, rather fascinating because he basically gave up music. I not gave up music, but he gave up playing professionally to teach chemistry and mathematics. You know about that in
yeah,
Westchester.
but the gig that I had with him was in the summer, and then that fall he started. That's when he started teaching. He was just like really fed up with the music business.
Yeah, and it was interesting. A friend of mine had asked him why he didn't teach music. He said he loved music too much to teach it in the school system and wanted to
That
retain
makes
his love for it, you know.
that makes total sense to me, you know, because I mean I never was a teacher either, but being around that kind of music is just exhausting. But
Yeah, I imagine so. But it's great you had that. See, I had no idea that you had had that kind of experience with Strozier. Now you
well,
had some interesting short short-lived perhaps experiences when you first got to New York. I was reading your biography and your Wikipedia page here, and it said something about you. You had had a little some experience with Buddy Rich. I
yeah, I
can't
don't talk.
imagine.
I don't. That's something I don't advertise. I got to go to correct my Wikipedia. I was in his band for 3 or 4 months doing one nighters, and it was just an excruciating experience. And that's all I want to say about it. Although I'll say one thing, Buddy wasn't nearly as bad a guy as he's as he's reputed to be, although he earned that reputation.
Yeah,
You
I,
know, John Hendricks told me when I was working with him on a movie, Buddy's name came up, and he says, if you want to know the real Buddy Rich, listen to him sing.
that's funny because I was just listening to him sing That Old Feeling.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah,
He sings it quite well. He does a really nice job
yeah,
of it.
yeah, yeah. But you know, the gig wasn't too much fun. The band wasn't that good, and I got out alive.
Yeah, well, there's yeah, that's one way to put it. Now your first record, now you're in New York and you make your first actual record of your own, which is a kind of interesting kind of record because it's got a bunch of saxophone players, Scott Hamilton and Flip Phillips. And how did that come about? And
Well, I was playing in Chuck Israel's band, and there was this guy coming around named Gus Datiris who was making these really cheap, quick records. And Jimmy Maxwell was my friend, and he was kind of a champion for me, you know. And he told this guy, said, "You need to record this guy." And so,
Jimmy Maxwell. Here's a funny thing: he gave Tom Harrell a present he gave him a book about trumpet playing, and he inscribed it to Tom. He said, "From my favorite trumpet player."
uh, oh, I love Jimmy Maxwell. But anyway, this guy, you know, literally put his arm around me and says, "I'm going to make you a star." And he says, "Put together any rhythm section you want and come in the studio and we'll record." So I took him at his
Sure.
word, and I put together this trio with Eddie Gomez and Eddie Moore, because I'd been playing with Eddie Gomez a little bit in another band. And so we started playing in, you know, some of those downtown places and Upper West Side little jazz clubs, you know, for about 6 months, and the music started getting really good. So I called this guy and I says, "Okay, we're ready." He says, "Okay, come in the studio on Tuesday, and the money will be here from Japan in 2 weeks." And I said, "Wait a minute." I said, you know, like, when the money's here, you tell me. And because I didn't want these two guys coming after me, you know, for money.
Right.
And so this went on for another 6 months. And I met David Baker, the recording engineer. And he told me this. I told him the story, and he said, "Give me the guy's number." And he called him up, and David calls me 10 minutes later and says, this guy's completely uh, uh, I can't say full of shit, you know, but and he said, "Let's figure out a way to do this." And so David single-handedly put my record together with a little demo from a radio broadcast I did on WKCR, and he just started sending it around. And a long story short, Inja Records bought it, and that's what started me, you know. And it got lucky, like it won an album of the year in Hi-Fi magazine. Remember that? And then it won a German equivalent of a Grammy. So it kind
Was
of
that the 14 bar blues
yeah.
record?
And so it kind of put me on the map in Europe, and I started getting gigs on the strength of that. And again, I'm still here.
Well, I kind of looked into your recording history, and I wanted to talk about that. As we said earlier, you had a great line. I said to save it for the show, but history with record companies, and I never really had a long relationship with a record company, and you've had a couple of relationships with record companies here, and you said something about them being dead, or what did you say?
Yeah, I outlived them, but they did manage to get out with some of my money.
They did, yes.
Yeah, but you know, when I started with Inja, this guy was young, and he was just, you know, started out, and he was full of ideals.
Is this
And you know,
Matthias Winkelmann?
yeah, and you know, like, I mean, you and I have both been around enough music business people to know that idealism quickly fades into materialism and capitalism. And so promises started getting broken. And, you know, I mean, they kept recording me, but, you know, at first they were booking my tours, then they stopped doing that. And then, you know, like at one point they stopped paying me money that they owed me. But, you know, how many times have you heard that story from somebody that's dealt with record companies? And you know,
Well, but for better or worse, the thing was that one thing was it kept you working the top shelf gigs.
it did
This
that. And also,
I think 10 years you had within 10 years, I think you made 11 records in 10 years or something like that for them.
yeah,
And
and you know, the thing that was really good with them right from the beginning is they would let me record anything I wanted to that they could afford. And so my second record was a live tape with Danny Richmond, which was the first time. Well, I'd played with Danny with Mingus one night, but it was the first gig we'd played together with the trio with Eddie. And then the record I made after that, they said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I would love to make a record with Tommy Flanagan." I'd never met Tommy Flanagan. And
but
they
he had
said, "Well,
recorded for Enges, I believe, here.
yeah," they said that can be done. And so
Correct. Yeah.
that's how that's how I came to record with him, and we became lifelong friends. And all, you know, then let's see, we did one of all Monk tunes when Monk was still living, you know, before tributes were the thing of the day. And
Right.
then I did one with Elvin Jones and Dave Holland. And then I did a couple more. And then then I went with other record companies for a while, and then I came back and did some things with them, you know, with Mulgrew and Kenny Barron and my 9-piece band, the Coleman Hawkins Project, you know.
Right. Now, also in between there was I've known a few friends of mine who did one record for Blue Note,
Oh, I did too.
or maybe two. I know you did too. That's what I mean. So you're ahead of a couple of those friends of mine. I
And
think.
I was signed for a third one.
Uh-huh. What happened there?
Well, you know, like the guy that ran the company got in trouble with the board of directors and had, you know, like what those people do is they start dropping artists and saying that that's the problem. And they got these new artists that are going to make them money, which of course it doesn't. And so this guy let me work on the record for 2 or 3 months, and then uh, uh, pulled the plug on it.
Uh-huh. Yes, I've had that happen too.
Oh yeah, well, if you're not in the record business if you haven't had that happen.
But this particular day, you got some, let's say some non-jazz, I think a broader audience reaching type of thing. You had Stevie Ray Vaughan and Dr. John
Yeah.
on Blue Note
Well, you
Records.
know, see that was the other thing is this was the resurgence of Blue Note, and they were trying to run it like a you know, like a commercial record company rather than as a jazz label. And they were trying to keep all of the good identity of a jazz label, but it had nothing to do, like with Inja, it was about making good records. With them, it was just about how much money you could make. And I, you know, it was at some point it became very apparent and out front, you know. And so there was never even any discussion of making the kind of jazz records that I've been making. You know, they said, we want to exploit the fact that you're from the South, and let's make a record of Southern music and see what happens. And I'd never heard of Dr. John or Stevie Ray Vaughan. And they gave me this list of artists that they thought I would, you know, I should consider. And I went and started doing my homework and made the records. And but it was and it was a great learning experience. Like Dr. John comes from a completely different musical aesthetic from jazz musicians, and I learned a lot from him. And playing with Stevie Ray Vaughan was really a thrill, and we became somewhat friends. He didn't live a lot longer than that, and but he was a beautiful cat and a beautiful musician, and so all of that was really positive. And the other great thing that happened with Blue Note is only because of Blue Note I met Jeanette, and so who I've been with for half my life. And you know, like I would put up with any of these negative things that I'm griping about to come out with Jeanette.
Wow. Now, how did that happen? I was
Well,
wondering.
that's a little harder one to tell because
I
they
knew you were
decided,
in your single years.
yeah, I
In
was
those
single.
years, we were both going through, different relationships and saw each other through those in our
Well,
youth.
you know, you were maybe, but like I was like, I was like very conservative and anyway, I'm messing with you. Uh, uh, so anyway, they wanted to make a video. This was the first days of MTV, and they wanted to do a video. And the cover of the album was a 1910 photograph from a New Orleans prostitute, very famous photograph. And they said, we need a girl to be that girl in the video. And so Dr. John had his ideas. He says, let's make the video a story about how this picture's made, you know, and stuff, you know. And so anyway, if you want to be successful with girls in New York and you don't have any money, this is where I learned you make a video. and and they'll, and they'll, all these girls will call you back, and so somebody recommended Jeanette to me, and then among other girls, like there was this other girl who was actually from the same small town in Tennessee where I was, who I didn't know, called, and I gave her the gig. And
The other girl.
I'm sorry.
The other girl, the
Yeah,
Tennessee
the
girl.
other girl. And then after it was over, I started calling Jeanette on the phone, and we talked. She was rehearsing for a play, and we talked to each other on the phone for 2 or 3 months before we ever went out together.
So you had met Jeanette and you had not given her the gig.
Right, right. And
That's how it started.
yeah, yeah.
You
And,
not giving her a gig.
and so I took her out on our first date, and she was doing a play that night, and I went to the play, and after the play, I had a driver, a Hungarian limo driver that I'd met, so he's waiting outside, and I took her to the bottom line to hear Sonny Rollins, and her ex-boyfriend was chasing us in his car all the way down, and this
Really?
yeah, and this beautiful Hungarian limo driver like eluded the guy, so Jeanette didn't know anything
She
about
tell
that.
you this? She didn't say, by the way, you're taking me out tonight. Maybe this guy chasing us.
No, well, it's like when we got in the car, he was behind us,
That was a surprise to her, though. She
Yeah,
didn't.
yeah. And so she had never heard of Sonny Rollins. And one of the other actors says, well, where's this guy taking you? And she says, downtown to hear some saxophone player. And she said, well, do you remember his name? And she said, yeah, his name's Sonny Rollins. And he says, wow, that's some saxophone player. All right. And so, that was the beginning of my second half of my life. And so I can never really complain too much about Blue Note.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, she also, I'm going to get back to her again because it may have had something to do with your move to California. But I just want to get to that. Before that, I wanted, since you mentioned Sonny, I remember that, you and I both were, friends with Sonny at that time in life. That, when I had just met Sonny, he said, do you know this guy, Bennie Wallace? And I said, yeah, no, we've met each other. We kind of started to hang out. And so, but you had a funny story about meeting Sonny.
Oh,
That was,
yeah. Yeah, it was his first night back. I don't think he'd played in New York for 2 or 3 years at least. He'd been in Europe, I think. I never really asked him about that. But
was this in like 1970?
72, I think.
I'm sorry, 72. That's
Yeah,
right.
it was
It's the same gig I met him at the Vanguard
yeah, yeah, he had Albert Daly and David Lee and Larry Ridley.
and
And
Larry Ridley. That was the band, Three Little
yeah,
Words.
and I went in. I was one of the last people that they let in because everybody wanted to be in there. And of course, as I'm standing in line to go in, I say, well, like I'm not going to be one of these people that rushes up to meet him after it's over. Like, Benny, be cool. Just because he was my hero, and I'd never seen him in person. And so the night of music was one that I will never forget as long as I live. People were cheering, and it gets to the end of the night, and there's this line standing to meet him, and I was right there in it. And when I get up to him, he said, I told him who I was, and I said, I'm a friend of Heikki Sarmanto. He says, oh, really? He says, I've heard about you. I hear you're really a bitch. And he said, I want to practice with you. He says, let's trade numbers. And so all I had for him to write on was my draft card. And so he wrote his phone number on it and, red magic marker or something like that, and
On your draft card, right?
yeah. And that's how we met. And then a few days later, I think he called me and he says, let's practice together. It was either Monday night or Tuesday night. And I said, well, I can't because I'm doing a concert in my loft. He says, where is it? And he came. And I remember he was sitting on the floor in that lotus position that he could do, and that's the last time I ever got nervous playing the saxophone. But it was really quite an experience to have Sonny Rollins there. But the funny thing about the story is that Heikki Sermonto had never heard me play. So Sonny had me confused with somebody
And
else.
you confused completely because I don't even know Heikki Sermonto, but you know, um, I had a story from that same week, actually that same night. It's quite possible that if you were standing in that procession, Sonny didn't go to the dressing room between sets. I remember he sat out on the benches
Uh-huh.
towards the, there, and there were a bunch of people kind of standing in almost procession, one by one, to talk to him, just say hello. Monty Waters was in the line
Uh,
and different people. And I remember being impressed by Sonny's ability to. Ira Sullivan told me this once about Charlie Parker. He said he could alter his vernacular to whoever he was speaking with. That that this was a gift that he had. So you would hear Monty Waters be, "Hey Sonny, how you doing, bro? It's been so good to get you back," and blah blah blah, this and that, and Sonny was like, "Yeah, baby, this and that and all that." And then, so Mr. Rollins, I'm Dr. Goldberg, and I'm Maurice Goldberg, and I've been enjoying your music for half a century now. Oh, that's what you're there for. Thank you very much. He would just go to be able to switch like that. So I felt like rather than stand in line, I had written him a letter that I never sent, and I sat next to him. And we were sitting there, and I kind of finally introduced myself next to him, said, "I'm a young saxophone player, and I just wanted to talk to you for a few minutes, but I'm just enjoying this. Go ahead, talk to everybody else." And so he had this scotch he was drinking, and he looked at me and like handed me the scotch glass. He's like, "You want some?" And I said, Sonny Rollins handing me a glass of scotch to have a sip from. Okay, so I took a sip and said thank you, and but then I got to talk to him, and I remember the thing I mentioned to him that I'll never forget was I said, "Sonny, this feeling, people are going absolutely crazy. I mean, they were like
well, they
swinging,
were.
they
I,
were,
I,
they were going nuts,
yeah.
and I think you and I both later in our careers did experience nights similar to that, where people really we were moved by the music to a great extent.
Mhm.
But at this point, I mean, I was 20 years old and I just turned 20. I had not really experienced that. I got some good responses, but I said, "This, wow, you must feel incredible. It must make you feel great." And Sonny said something I'll never forget. He said, "Well, you see, it's all about finding the middle ground." He said, "Because audiences are very fickle. One day they love you, next day you've disappointed them." He said, "So if you get too excited when they like you like this, it can't it's not very good." He said, "I just try to hold the middle ground. I see this as a test that their enthusiasm is a test that that's being thrown at me to maintain my middle ground and
Well,
not."
that's part of the wisdom of Sonny Rollins right there.
It is. The other bit of wisdom that I love to tell is that after two nights, I came back the second night, and we'd been talking about everything from Chu Berry to Yogananda, and Sonny says to me, I asked him if I could study with him, and he said he didn't teach. I said, "Oh," he said, "but maybe we could practice together." He said, "I don't teach, but we could practice together. But first, let me ask you something." I said, "What?" He said, "From the way you talk about music, I imagine you must play pretty well." Do you? And after hearing him play that stuff, I like completely took a long time to answer that one. I didn't know if I do. Do I compared to what? Compared to this? No, I'm not even scratching the surface. But do I play well? Well, so for lack of anything else to say, I said, "Yes, Sonny, I can play." And he's that big beaming smile of Sonny. It was like when Sonny would give you that smile, it was like the sun coming out. He says, "Isn't it nice when you know you're good?"
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
So you took your wife. That's a memorable first date too. What a beautiful. I mean, you
Oh
started
yeah,
at the top. You're
yeah.
bringing the top woman to hear the top musician.
I remember he came out on the stage at the bottom line and he was playing "I'll Be Seeing You in All the Familiar Places." And I believe he played that melody for 6 or 7 courses before he started really deviating, and it was like, whoa, it was one of many extraordinary evenings of hearing him play.
Sonny played Love Letters one night
Oh,
when the half note had moved uptown, right? And this
yeah.
has literally happened to me. I'm sitting there, and he's doing the thing. He's teasing you, and he's doing this, and he's playing Love Letters, playing the melody at the melody for a few chords. Then it starts to get a little more, deeper into it and into it. Now I'm starting to sit forward in my chair now, and now a couple more courses in it, I'm leaning a little bit more forward until I think he can't play anymore on this song anymore, and then he goes there, and the next thing I knew, I was out of my chair and standing up. I mean, it's like the music actually pulled me out of my chair, and I'm like standing up, and I didn't realize. I said, "Oh, I'd sit down." I had to realize that I had stood up.
Oh, he could do
So,
that.
how strong it was. And that made me think of another thing I was going to talk to you about that you and I have always shared. Um, there's what Sonny would call one time. Sonny said, "Well, we're tunesmiths," and the fact that he included me as being a fellow tunesmith it was an honor. I felt that, and I thought that you were too, and Ira Sullivan, and there were certain people that Dave Frischberg once said. We were talking about it, and maybe I don't think it's as cut and dried as Dave put it, but he said, there's two kinds of cats that play instruments, that play music. He said some people got into it and are in it to play the instrument. He said, but then there's other people that got into music to play songs. And, I think that you have to love the instrument you're playing, but that primarily, I think that the love of songs and tunes is what, would they be, standards, uh, originals, but just the idea of songs. I think that you have a vast knowledge of songs, and you and I have always discussed different tunes and the changes and the way to play them and versions we like of them. And, that's been a strong part of our relationships. There are other people like Mike Brecker, who I had a very strong relationship with musically. We were into patterns and musical logic and all kinds of beautiful things together. But Mike was a great player and a genius, but not a tunesmith. You know,
Right.
he was that was not an aspect. Mike wanted to play the instrument better than anybody, and he did. And to me, that wasn't a detriment. It was just that that wasn't you know, we never really got into discussing obscure standards of like what the right changes to Twilight Time was, or
Mhm.
something like that, where you and I will be talking about, I concentrate on you as we recently have.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing that I had a wonderful teacher again when I was before high school that my band director turned me into, my clarinet teacher, Joella Blackburn, and she taught me the one of the Brahms clarinet sonatas, and she was really a brilliant musician, and she taught me how you play a line and how that line grows from the beginning of the phrase to the end of the phrase, that there's an arc to it, and that's a kind of an awkward explanation for it. But I've always been attracted to like to that emotional component of the music. Again, the way that as a saxophone player, the first guys that I were listening to, I only listened to the blues because I didn't understand tunes, but all those guys like Lockjaw and that played with Count Basie and Sonny and Stanley Tarantine and those guys, there was something about the emotion. I don't know, emotion's an awkward word for it, but like uh, there's something about the sound of the instrument and melody and line that I've always been attracted to, which is similar. And the tunesmith part of it is an aspect of that, because like when I
Right.
You know, I'm sure I know you're the same way, but when I'm learning a new tune, whether it's to record or to perform, I don't go to horn players. Like I just go, I listen, well, what did Frank Sinatra do with it? What did Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald, what did Dinah Washington do with it? You know, and that, uh, that vocal aspect of it is, to me, that's the heart of it. We keep talking about Sonny Rollins, but like take his recording of "There Is No Greater Love" on the Way Out West album.
Right.
Tell me that that didn't come from Billie Holiday's recording.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He's in E flat instead of B flat. He's playing the tempo and the phrasing. It's that, like he got it from that.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely that aspect there. In fact, I've talked to Sonny about that, about vocalists and the feeling
Yeah.
of, because I think the word is feeling more than emotion. For me,
Yeah.
emotion
Yeah,
really
that's
comes.
the word. That's the word. Yeah. Yeah. And I've, like to me, it's like about sound and feeling, like when I hear Ben Webster play a ballad, it's like, it's not, it's like a three-dimensional object, that sound. It's like it's there in the room with you, and any good musician is going to have, any musician that I really truly love and get emotionally moved by is going to have that quality, you know.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, Brahms. It's funny, but having had at one point, I got really fascinated with Brahms because of his melodic sense.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I was like this, and a friend of mine said, "Well, you know what Brahms was?" I said, "Well, I mean, among many things, Brahms was a barroom piano player, man. He knew all the tunes of his era. He was a tunesmith. He
Mhm.
knew, and there it is. And his sense of line and melody was created by the pop songs of Germany.
And
In
those lines were so organic and across the bar. It was, oh man, again, like that just, uh, that was the thing that just really turned me on. I mean, when I confronted Mozart, I didn't really appreciate it like Brahms because of that one thing. And of course, what I didn't realize is that Mozart had that too. It was just so much more sophisticated. But anyway, now I'm talking about something I don't know about.
well, but it's sort of like the begats too, because the sense of melody that Mozart had, was the flow of it. I feel a similarity to Brahms latching onto the same thread of feeling that's there from Mozart through
Mhm.
Bird, through Rollins, hopefully through us, and it's that feeling of melody. Though I'll tell you one funny Mozart story. I got to meet Warren Marsh only one time. He was playing at Buddy's place in the '70s with super sax, and I came down to hear him, and I had never met him, and I'd been hanging with Lee Konitz, and I think I'd just done my record with Lee and everything, and I'd always wanted to meet Warren, so I came down and I introduced myself to Warren and said I was friend of Lee's and student of Lee's and friend, and could I take him for breakfast? So after the gig, we went to this little spot for a hamburger or something for breakfast, eggs over easy, whatever it was, and we started talking about music, and he said how much Bach was the epitome of musical grace, and that everything really was centered upon Bach, the idea of line and this and that. And then I started to mention Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante in E flat for violin and viola, which I enjoy the double cadenzas. I said sort of reminded me of Lee and Warren of their time, even the kind of counterpoint that was there. And I started to mention Mozart, and Warren was like, Mozart? Oh no, I can't stand Mozart.
Yes.
I never heard anybody ever say that they hated Mozart. He said, "Oh, he just played a bunch of licks. That's all he was doing." And I thought that was an interesting thing that Warren said that. Um, Another thing I was thinking about was, well, two things. I mean, two or three things. One thing is I still want to get to your going to Hollywood, and I want to get into more of your marriage and all that. and but and the overtones. But you have not made a record. You had a very very prolific recording career, and it's probably been about 17, 18 years ago that you made your last recording.
It's been that long. Wow.
It's been that long. I was checking it out, and I it just seemed that like you had this very prolific period with over 20 records, 20 records, let's say, as a leader in 30 years, not to mention the sidemen stuff, and then it just suddenly came to a halt. So let's say what happened chronologically is I remember you were still recording for Anja, and then you met Jeanette, and then next thing I knew, you were going to California, and I was going to Canada, and that's when we lost touch with each other for several
Right.
years. What can you pick it up where leaving New York and deciding to go to California and all this? How did all that come about for you?
Well, it was an accident. I'd made the record that I made with Stevie Ray Vaughan. Like there was a film director out there who was doing his first film, and they had, the films will have a deal with the record company, and so they had a deal with this one company, and it fell through. And then at the last minute, they made a deal with Capitol Records, which owned Blue Note, and so this guy was just going through these records and listening to the first 2 minutes and throwing them aside, and he liked mine, and he hired me to come out and write a song for the end of his movie. So Dr. John and I went out there and we wrote this song together and recorded it. And this guy loved it, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, the movie was a hit. And so,
Was the movie Bull Durham, which was
yeah, it was Bull Durham,
I
and
remember that.
so all of a
And you
sudden he
played
was,
tenor in that movie too, right? You hear your
yeah, yeah, at the end of the movie. Well, a couple of places I played
couple of
tenor.
places in the film.
Yeah,
I was watching the movie, man, and I was going, "Gee, I really like that tenor player," and I was saying that's an interesting way to use music in a film, and because it wasn't overused. But then at the end there was that song. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just I
no, 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 it's fine. But anyway, all of a sudden he was the golden boy in Hollywood for a minute, and I was his guy.
Tom
And
Shelton.
and yeah, and he hired me to do his second movie, and Jeanette and I went out there with a couple of suitcases, and before we knew it, we were living there. And that's when I was like, I was having trouble with Blue Note Records, and that was everything. The music business was just like very difficult, and so this was a chance. My dream was to make enough money doing that so I could finance my jazz career without having to make money. It didn't work, but I tried, and so I was out there, and I did several movies, and I was still making records. I made another one for Inja, and I made one for Audio Quest, and
And one
that.
for Just in Time too, right?
I'm sorry.
One for Just in Time.
Oh, that was not my record. That was Nancy King and Glenn Moore's record. I was playing on it.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, Justice Records, which they call Just Us,
right.
and but anyway, I was making those records and still trying to tour, but it was difficult because if you've got a tour, you've got to make a commitment 6 months ahead. Although and you might get a call on Friday afternoon and start doing a movie on Monday. It's just so it got very difficult, and I was out there for 7 years doing that, and then I came back and started really getting into playing. I mean, I was playing the whole time I was out there, and I had a lot of time to practice when I wasn't working on movies.
Right. And you developed a relationship with Jimmy Rolls for a while out
Well,
there.
that was the best thing that happened out there, is if we became friends, and he really taught me a lot. And also I got to work with some really good singers, and they taught me a lot about what we were talking about earlier. And but then I came back in '97, and you know, started making records again. I made another one for Audio Quest and another one for Insha, and then I did the Coleman Hawkins project, which turned into about 5 years of gigs in Europe with this 9-piece band. And you know, and it was during that time, you know, like this getting us up like to 2008, and by that time there's no record business anymore. You know, there's you know, we didn't really make a lot of money making records, but we made money. And to me, everything since then has been vanity records. You know, I understand from a recording studio that I worked at a lot that, you know, on Blue Note Records, if you make a record for them, you pay for the record and then they own it. You know, and we're not talking about wannabes, we're talking about established artists. And you know, so I quit making records because there was no business anymore. I mean, I've got some stuff in the can that could be records. I did a Dizzy Gillespie project a few years ago with the 9-piece band, which is done with video and everything, and I've just never gotten around to doing anything. And then just before COVID, we did another 9-piece recording that was kind of a last minute recording of all original music. And the music was really fun and we almost put it out, but I wasn't really happy with the fidelity of the record, and I didn't do anything with it. But you know, I don't know. I'm not dead yet. I may make some more. But
Well, now they call it legacy recordings. You know, like anything that I'm making, they say, well, of course, you know, you're making a legacy recording. You know, getting a recording of Walter Davis Jr. and I did a concert in Salerno, Italy, 1989, and finally it looks like it will be coming out, you know, this year.
beautiful.
For years, yeah, well, for years I couldn't give it away, you know, but now, fortunately, you know, Corey Weeds of Cellar Jazz is, you know, interested and wants
Great.
to put it out, but and you know, but there's no real nobody's expecting any real money for it, but it's what they call a legacy. Right.
Right.
I'm just happy to have anybody interested in the legacy.
And you know, by the time I finished those few years of, like, I think it was about 5 years that I was touring with the Coleman Hawkins Disorder at the Border project. By that time, backcountry jazz started, and all of a sudden, like, I've got this opportunity to make music without getting on an airplane. And like now, I may never get on an airplane again unless there's something I really want to do. You know, I make my music here, and like every day I work on music, and there's no distractions. You know, I don't have to call any booking agents or record company people, or you know, it's you know, I thank God for Jeanette. She takes care of everything, and so I just get up in the morning and work on music all day, and that's, for me, that's as happy as I've ever been in my life.
That's great. I mean, now Jeanette had an acting career as well, or
Well, when I met her, she went to the NYU Tisch School of the Arts and studied. It was like one of the major acting schools, and you know, after she got out, she did some things for Joseph Papp, the Public Theater, and you know, some other things. And then she met me and decided she'd rather be a saxophone player's wife than deal with the acting business. And I don't know how smart that was, but it was sure fortunate for me.
well, that's great. I mean, I'm glad that you guys have been so happy. It's just a beautiful thing that you found that.
Yeah.
And you know, well, I mean, getting back to just our youth a little bit. Um, one thing I'll never forget, and I know we got to wrap it up pretty soon, uh, is when I went to Brazil in 1974 for 7 months. Uh, I had a little basement apartment in the village, and you were in between pads, and so I rented you, you sublet or whatever it is, in my little basement apartment in the village, and my neighbors who were like, you know, pretty tolerant of me. I would practice like 5 or 6 hours a day, much of the week. Um, they were so happy when I came back. They said, they said that guy you rented it to, that Bennie Wallace, he's going about 8 to 10 hours a day, and he's playing these overtones, these sounds, and one thing, this is mostly for saxophone players to know, is that I mean, understanding how to play the overtones and getting the enrichment it gives to your sound is an important thing. And of course, anybody that got into Sonny Rollins for a certain period, I mean, Coltrane does it too, and I mean, a lot of guys did it. Archie Shepp did it. It's not a brand new thing, but Benny, one aspect of the way you play is your creative and original use of double stops and overtones. So, when we would practice together, I'd show Benny some of the harmonic ideas I was involved with in practicing, and Benny would show me some of the overtone stuff he was doing and everything. So I wrote him. I remember a thing that I had a lot of time to practice in Brazil, in a place where I didn't have to worry about my neighbors at all. And if he could show me, there was questions I had. I wrote him 2 or 3 questions. We used to write letters in those days about overtones, like that I would like to ask him. And Benny responded with, I believe it was somewhere between 15 and 22 pages of really precise instruction on how to practice this stuff. Yeah, I mean, if they have internet in those days, man, we would have made a pamphlet or made a book of it. It was like he wrote me a book about it, and so I always remembered you're doing that. And so and we were talking also about how I used to play the verse to Stardust, using it like playing a tune. You described it. First, you learn the melody, then you try to play the melody. What were you saying in?
With the overtones. I mean, I don't do this all the time, but I should do it more. But you play this. Some Joe Allard showed me. You play the melody and then you play it using overtones wherever you can, and it does something for your sound, because it makes it's like you're basically playing the horn like a bugle. So you've got to do, your anatomy has to do what the voice would do in order to produce the sound, or it won't come out. And but I got into that because I was a clarinet player, and I played a lot of interesting music when I was a clarinet player that like went over like way up into the 3rd octave, and like unusual music like Bartok contrasts and things like that.
Right.
And so I was interested in finding some of that area on the saxophone when I came to New York, and again, for better or for worse. And so I couldn't get up high. I could play a high G or maybe an A, but I couldn't have much control over there. And so I went to Joe Allard, and he showed me how you can get up to 16 overtones. And it was through learning that I was able to start playing lines on the saxophone that go over the 3 octaves.
That's right. So did he talk to you about the larynx?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Joe drew me that picture. Remember, he would draw a picture. He'd say, people talk about playing with an open throat. He says, but no, it's all about your larynx. And Joe would do this. He would go.
Yeah.
And he could almost do it from the lowest note of the piano to the high. You remember how he could do that? I never, it was phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So and then the actual overtone thing was another aspect of it. And the other thing that I really, I mean, I'm so much into those older saxophone players, Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins and Lockjaw and those guys, and how they could use sound and use overtones to change the sound, and you've got those, like if you play like a middle C, as you can finger a low C and get that same sound, and so it vents and gives you 2 different sounds. But on some of those notes, there's a third one that that will make a sound that's like oscillating between two pitches. Like, and you hear tenor players always do it. You hear Ben Webster do it a lot on a second octave B flat. You know, you've heard it and I've heard it. It's like they'll do that. It's like a little grandstand thing on the blues, you know.
So you hear a fifth in it? Is that where is that the other?
I don't think it's a fifth. Uh, it's funny. I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I started looking around like how you can vent as many of the notes as possible, and I found notes to where you can get three sounds, you know, three different colors on a sound, you know. Like, you know, we were talking about that recording the other day that I did of Dancing in the Dark. You know, there's something in the middle of the first eight where I'm venting the notes on the B flat in three different
Yeah,
ways.
that's a
You
nice
know,
in the first chorus.
it's that kind of thing. You know, there's all of these sound possibilities that are built from the overtones. It's, you know, it's like playing the overtones is one thing, but it just kind of opens up all of these textural possibilities. You know, like one of the hardest notes to do it is a low G. You know, because anytime you try to vent, it'll either go down or it'll go up to a G sharp. And I found the only way you can do that is like to take the right hand and move it over and hold the G sharp key down while you're doing it, you know.
Oh.
That's the most, and because, you know, G is such a common note, you want to be able to do that, you know.
You mean the G sharp? You mean the low C sharp key?
Yeah, like you know, like you're playing a G, and if you vent it, that's any of those palm of little finger notes or the G sharp key is going to fly open when you start venting the G. So like I'll like move my right hand up and hold that G sharp key down while I'm doing that, you know.
I'll try that.
Yeah, it's kind of like an acrobatic thing. Like, did you ever try to play a low A?
I put my knee in the bell.
There you go. That, yeah. I wrote a tune on a New Orleans tune on one of the Blue Note records where it had a low G in it, you know, and I would do that thing, you know.
White Men Can't Jump. That was like the last one of your last movies, right? That you did.
Well, that was I did some other things after that. It was the last one that was kind of popular. The best one that I did was after that I got hired to write a big MGM movie on Betty Boop, and that was the best gig that I ever had because Richard and Lily Zanuck were producing it, and they saw how little I'd been paid on White Men Can't Jump, and they doubled my money, and you know, they were like really good people, man, and we were doing all of this really interesting pre-records because it was an animated movie, and so you had to record the music before they made the cartoons, you know.
What's the actual title of the film?
It was just Betty Boop.
Just
And
Betty Boop.
yeah, and so, you know, I put together a band with let's see who was in there that you would know. Pete Jolly was playing piano. Uh, Snooky Young, Buddy DeFranco, Joe Temperley, and Art Barron. And so we put together this band, and we were writing songs for the movie and recording them. You know, it was big fun. And the guy that got me the job, who was the music supervisor on the movie, was a wonderful guy named Bones Howe. And I remember we were standing outside on the porch of the Zanuck's office one day, and he says, "Man," he says, "I've never done a project where the music was so uniformly loved by the people producing it." He says, "There's always some problems, and there's never been a problem."
That's well, you look what you got together, yeah.
The next day, practically the next day, they fired the head of the studio, Alan Ladd Jr., I guess he was, and they hired a marketing guy to take his place, and he threw the movie out.
Oh no.
Yeah, and so we never finished it, but
No,
It was a
that's
lot of fun,
terrible.
and in the world of Hollywood, it was my big break because it was like a major a major movie, and it was a big break for a lot of the animation people.
So it
But it
probably
was,
helped
it was
you move
kind of
back
lucky
east and try
because
your,
otherwise I might still be out there or
yeah.
be dead because film composers don't really live very long lives. That's another story.
I mean, well, I mean, I guess it enabled you to come
I
back and
can't
buy
hear
it.
you.
Well, I mean, I guess it enabled you to move back east and live in the manner that you're uh, now living in, which is quite a step up from my basement apartment on McDougal
Ah,
Street.
yeah. Well, some of those places we lived in those days were
The-
wonderful.
that
Yeah,
apartment on
no.
Grant Street where you and Dennis Irwin and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
The other thing was you did a tune with Aretha Franklin too, right? Wasn't there a
oh my God. Yeah, that's another sad story. But
if
we
I
we were
lose?
we were doing White Men Can't Jump, and we were fighting with the music department at the studio. And so the director and I were having a meeting with them, and they said, well, you got this tune, and we want you to either get Mariah Carey or Michael Bolton to do it. And I came back and I said, no, we want either Ray Charles or Aretha Franklin. And they just, these long faces, and they were just more, they saw their money going away. And I remember, and this was one of the reasons that I didn't do well in Hollywood, because I couldn't resist sticking it in. I said, wait a minute, I've got a better idea than any of it. And they all looked up, and I said, let's get Nina Simone. And
that got Aretha right away, right?
yeah, yeah. So anyway, I wrote the tune, and I went to the Capitol Records offices of this guy that was producing like from the record company's position. And I had a phone appointment with Aretha, and I talked to her, and she sang the tune to me over the phone. It was perfect.
Wow.
Because my inspiration was the record that she did, where she did Skylark, years ago,
Oh yeah, I remember that
where
standard.
she sang standards. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. And so a couple of weeks later, she wanted to record in Detroit. So at her studio where she recorded. And so we got this great piano from the Detroit Symphony. I flew in my friend Bill Huntington to play bass, Grady Tate, and Tommy Flanagan. And so we get there. It should have been done in 30 minutes. It took 5 hours to get this thing, because the film company had been harassing Aretha, and she had no management, and she was just mad as a hornet, and just completely unfocused. And so we did it, and it's what it is. But I remember when we were leaving, like we were all exhausted, and as Aretha's leaving, she says to Tommy Flanagan, says, Tommy, I'm going to be singing at the Carlisle. Would you accompany me? And the expression on Tommy's face was just priceless, like look of that subdued terror that.
The raised eyebrow. I remember Tommy was always
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the one
And
eyebrow raised.
and every time that I saw Tommy out there, I says, when's your gig at the Carlisle coming up? And and I actually wrote a tune for him that I was going to call At the Carlisle. And we were at the rehearsal, and it was difficult. But what a lot of people didn't know about Tommy Flanagan is he was a great reader. And he read this thing down. And when he got to the end of playing through the melody and made it, he looked up at me and he said, handcuffs. And that became the name of the tune. So At the Carlisle never quite made it.
It's called handcuffs.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we have kind of run out of time. We could keep on going, but well, I have this list of questions. You see, folks, this is what I do a little research, and I say, what do I want to ask this cat? and we covered most, I think, just about everything. Uh, oh, unfortunately, I was going to say this lack of being able to travel. I'm feeling this too. I feel like, thank God I missed the airports. I did all my airport time because I sure don't miss all the horror stories I'm hearing of people traveling now.
Oh, it's awful.
But because of this condition, the one thing I regret about not traveling is not being able to come up and play your thing in Connecticut with you.
Oh man, that would be so
It,
cool. But I mean, the same thing, man. Like I miss going to Europe and seeing my friends and playing for those audiences. But when I start thinking about what's going to happen from the time you get to the airport, I mean, we both hear these horror stories. I mean, our friend Jerry Bergonzi says he never takes a saxophone to Europe anymore. He just plays what they have. That's
really?
no, that's no fun. You know, and I hear bass players. It's like every time somebody comes home, it's a story that just is appalling. And like in the back of my house, there's this beautiful open sky, and sometimes like I'll see an airplane way up there, and like I'm down here with all these trees, and I'm happy, and I look and when I see that airplane, I say, I know exactly what it smells like in there.
That's true. Anyway, man, it's been a great thrill, great pleasure.
Bob, I love you and I love your music, and we've just had so much fun over the years, and I'm glad to be reconnected and hear
Yeah,
your
right back
musical
at you.
hear your musical voice and your verbal voice again. And God bless you, man.
God bless you too, Benny. And what a lovely time I had today with you and getting to talk at depth. And I hope that, and I know that this was very enlightening for anybody that's been watching this. I learned a lot. And, you're a wonderful raconteur as well as you play. You're extremely, fun to listen to you tell your stories of your life. And I feel we've gotten some insight into what makes the great Bennie Wallace who he is. And that's about it for On the Real Side for today. There are certain things I'm supposed to say now, which is about if you enjoyed this, to give us to say so on the internet whenever I believe this means something, to give us a like of some kind. I never even asked people to like me in high school, so it was you know it's a little awkward. But if you dug it, indicate in all the appropriate generational ways now that you might do it in modern times in the cyberspace. Indicate that you have. And we have some other illustrious guests coming up. And I thank you very much again, Jessy. I want to thank Jessy Kaiser, who you've been looking at with us. I realized I didn't introduce you, Jessy. Jessy is my co-producer and generally does everything on this podcast that you'll see in terms of designing it, editing it, and doing all this. Just everything but the talking. And thank you, Jessy.
It's a pleasure, Rob. It's a
Yeah.
pleasure.
And once again, thank you, Benny. And we'll see you again next Thursday for another episode of
Thanks so much, Bob.
On the Real Side. Thank you, Benny. God bless.
You too.
Bye bye, everybody.